In 2023, a quiet neighborhood in Bakersfield, California, was shaken by the murder of 56-year-old Margaret Dalton, a retired school administrator and beloved member of her church. Her husband of nearly 3 decades, 58-year-old Harold Dalton, was arrested on the scene, sitting on the front steps of their house with a .38 revolver in his lap. Neighbors described him as always polite, maybe a little distant, but calm. His only words to the police: "She lied to me for 27 years." The case quickly caught national attention, but few could have predicted the depths of betrayal, identity, and psychological collapse that would unfold. Story: Harold and Margaret Dalton had been married since 1996. Their relationship had always appeared traditional, if somewhat reserved. They never had children, and Harold often blamed fate for that. Friends assumed they were simply a private couple. Harold worked in construction and later managed a hardware store. Margaret, who held a master's in education, served as vice principal at a local high school until her early retirement. They lived in a modest, well-kept house with a tidy yard and matching lawn chairs they rarely used. On March 3, 2023, Harold returned home early from work. According to his confession, he had been looking through the attic for an old photograph to use for a 60th birthday surprise for Margaret. What he found instead was a locked file box, one Margaret had always kept hidden. Inside, among tax forms and hospital bills, was an envelope containing her old birth certificate, issued in 1965 under the name Martin James Albrecht. Harold later said in his statement, "I stared at that paper for 20 minutes. I thought it was a joke. I thought maybe it was someone else's. But then I saw the photo under it. It was her. Him, I don't know. I couldn't breathe." Within the hour, Margaret was dead. According to the police report, Harold confronted her in the kitchen, asked a single question: "Is it true?" And when she didn't answer, shot her in the chest. She died before the paramedics arrived. 2 days after the shooting, Bakersfield police began reconstructing the couple's life together. Interviews with friends, neighbors, and co-workers revealed a pattern. Margaret and Harold were perceived as distant, but functional. They attended church together, hosted modest barbecues in the summer, and never argued publicly. But beneath that surface, investigators uncovered a household marked by quiet control. Detective Andrea Suarez, lead on the case, noted in her early reports that Margaret had isolated herself from family decades ago, and that no one from her side had visited their home in over 10 years. When officers reached out to contacts listed in her personnel files, most had outdated phone numbers or were deceased. The only living relative they found was a cousin in Denver who said, "Margaret cut ties with the family after college. We always assumed it was about something personal. I never knew why." Medical records subpoenaed from a now-defunct clinic in San Francisco pointed to Margaret undergoing gender-confirming surgery in the late 1980s. Her name change was legally documented in 1992, 4 years before she met Harold at a hardware store where he worked. There were no signs she ever violated any laws. Her documentation was complete, consistent, and legally binding. But it was the couple's marriage certificate that drew attention. While the state of California had already begun accepting legal gender changes by 1996, small inconsistencies in Margaret's paperwork, an old insurance policy, a lapsed medical license under the name M. Albrecht, suggested she had taken careful steps to ensure Harold would never uncover the truth. "He loved her," said Karen Bell, Harold's co-worker of 15 years. "He really did. But he also believed in a very rigid idea of what marriage is. Traditional. Church-going. He never even joked about gender or sexuality. I don't think he could handle gray areas." Meanwhile, Harold remained in custody, undergoing psychological evaluation at the Kern County Detention Facility. According to jail staff, he barely ate or slept, refusing visitors and declining to speak to a public defender. His only communication was a handwritten note to the detective. "What she did to me was worse than cheating, worse than betrayal. It was a lie so big I lost my mind." Detective Suarez obtained a court order to access Margaret's sealed medical records and educational history, hoping to piece together the life she left behind. What emerged was a fragmented portrait of a quiet but determined individual who had reinvented herself after a traumatic youth. Born in Des Moines, Iowa, Martin Albrecht was the only child of a conservative Lutheran family. School records indicated a bright, introverted student who excelled in English and social sciences. But the real insight came from an anonymous letter sent to the Bakersfield Police Department just days after Margaret's death. It was signed only RT and postmarked from Sacramento. "She was my friend," it read. "Back then, in college, we both lived in fear. She wanted to be a teacher more than anything, but she knew Iowa would never let her live in peace. When she told her father about transitioning, he beat her and threw her out. She vanished after that. I thought she was dead. I'm glad she found a life. I'm sorry it ended this way." Investigators tracked the author down. Rachel Thompson, now 59, a retired librarian who had once attended the same university. Her testimony, though informal, filled crucial gaps. Margaret had cut all ties to her family after being outed and assaulted by her father. She moved to San Francisco in 1988, worked odd jobs to pay for surgery, and began the long, bureaucratic process of changing her identity. Rachel's statement: "She didn't lie to hurt anyone. She lied to survive." Meanwhile, Harold's court-appointed psychologist, Dr. Elias Canner, began sessions with him at the Kern County Jail. Early reports described Harold as rigid in thought, emotionally stunned, and prone to obsessive loops. Canner noted a strong attachment to traditional gender roles and religious frameworks. To Harold, he wrote, the idea that his entire marriage was built on what he now sees as a fundamental deception shattered his internal structure. But Canner also noted something else, a long-standing discomfort with intimacy. In 27 years of marriage, the couple had never sought counseling for infertility or appeared to pursue adoption. Harold reportedly explained it away as God's plan. When asked about their sex life, Harold refused to answer. "Something's off," Canner wrote. "This isn't just rage, it's identity collapse." Margaret's funeral was held quietly, without any family in attendance. Her will, prepared years earlier, named only Harold as next of kin. As her death certificate was processed, legal debates erupted over how her identity should be recorded: Margaret Dalton or Martin Albrecht. The coroner ultimately honored her chosen identity, a decision that triggered backlash from local conservative groups. Simultaneously, Harold's preliminary hearings began. His public defender, Eric Blanchard, entered a plea of not guilty by reason of temporary insanity, citing Harold's mental breakdown following the discovery. The courtroom was tense. The prosecution, led by Assistant District Attorney Lillian Cho, pushed for second-degree murder, arguing that Harold had a choice in how he reacted and chose violence. In court documents, Cho wrote, "Margaret Dalton posed no physical threat. The defendant had no criminal record, no history of domestic abuse. This was not a spontaneous act of self-defense. It was a conscious decision to destroy someone over a truth he found uncomfortable." But Blanchard's defense relied heavily on psychological evaluation. Dr. Canner testified in a closed session, detailing Harold's background. Raised in a strict Pentecostal household, with a father who frequently preached that homosexuality and gender confusion were sins. Canner emphasized that Harold had likely repressed his own fears and uncertainties for decades, and that the shock of discovery collided with years of rigid moral programming, producing what he termed a cognitive implosion. Meanwhile, police unearthed one potential clue, suggesting that Harold's suspicions may have existed long before the attic discovery. In 2009, Margaret visited a private clinic in Los Angeles to renew hormone therapy, a fact not disclosed to Harold. The prescription was under the name M. Dalton. An old receipt found in Harold's workshop had M. Your Dalton Clinic scribbled on the back in his handwriting. Detectives now questioned, had Harold known something was off for years? Detective Suarez raised a chilling question in her latest report. Did he confront her because he had just found out, or because he had always suspected and finally confirmed it? As pre-trial motions concluded and jury selection began, the media presence outside the courthouse intensified. Protesters and counter-protesters filled the sidewalks, some demanding justice for Margaret as a victim of gender-based violence, others defending Harold's right to know and framing the case as a betrayal of traditional values. The courtroom itself, however, remained stark and subdued. Neither side was allowed to speak publicly. The judge, Mary Ann Beck, had issued a strict gag order to limit media distortion. Inside, tensions rose as the prosecution submitted a new motion to admit evidence of Harold's internet search history. Forensic experts had recovered deleted browser data from Harold's old laptop. Several entries dated back to 2017 included searches like, "Can a woman hide if she was born male?" "Signs your wife might be trans?" "Legal name change after surgery California." Prosecutor Lillian Cho argued that this proved suspicion long preceded the discovery in the attic, and that the killing was not sudden, but the final act in a slow-burning internal storm. The defense countered that curiosity did not equate to certainty, and that Harold had never acted on any of these thoughts until the moment of discovery triggered a full psychological collapse. Harold remained mostly silent in court, his demeanor subdued and distant. He responded to questions in brief, monotone answers. But a moment of tension erupted when Cho showed jurors a photo of Margaret from her early transition years, recovered from an old college ID. Harold visibly flinched. When the judge asked if he needed a break, he muttered, "She lied with her face. I didn't see it for 27 years. Meanwhile, investigators uncovered that Margaret had made two separate legal name changes, one in California in 1992 and an earlier sealed petition in Oregon in 1989. Why the double process? Experts in transgender legal advocacy explained that many individuals had to navigate inconsistent state policies in the 80s and 90s, often starting paperwork multiple times due to discrimination or rejection. Detective Suarez contacted the now-retired physician who had overseen Margaret's surgery. He confirmed Margaret had been meticulous, respectful, and terrified of being exposed. She wanted to teach. That's all she ever talked about. She just wanted a normal life. As the trial date approached, Judge Beck granted the prosecution's request to classify the act as potentially aggravated by bias, opening the door for hate crime enhancements. Just a week before opening arguments, a break in the case came not from a legal document or digital record, but from the floorboards of the Daltons' master bedroom. While preparing the house for evidence archiving, Detective Suarez noticed an uneven floor panel under the closet shelving. Underneath it was a small metal box, sealed and wrapped in cloth. Inside, Margaret's journal. It spanned nearly 15 years, from 2004 to 2019, and was written in neat, cursive handwriting. There were entries about work stress, Harold's temper, and her deep fear of being discovered. Most of all, the journal chronicled her loneliness. "He loves me in his way," she wrote in 2007, "but he's afraid of emotions. We don't talk about things that matter. Sometimes I wish I could tell him, but I've seen how he reacts to anything outside his comfort zone. I'd rather be loved half honestly than hated fully." In a 2013 entry, she described a moment when Harold made an offhand remark after seeing a transgender woman on the news. He had said, "These freaks, always trying to lie their way into normal life." Margaret wrote, "It felt like my lungs stopped. I smiled. I had to." The journal was deemed admissible, and during pre-trial hearings, it was read, carefully, selectively, by both the prosecution and defense. The prosecution presented it as evidence of fear, manipulation, and emotional isolation inflicted by Harold. The defense argued that the journal showed Margaret knowingly deceived Harold for decades, aware of the emotional harm it might cause. The press got wind of the journal's existence, leading to a new wave of opinion columns, social media outrage, and legal debates about posthumous consent. LGBTQ+ organizations argued the journal revealed Margaret's humanity, her impossible position, and her attempt to survive in a world that offered her no safe space. Opposing voices used the same entries to claim Harold had been emotionally violated. Meanwhile, the jury remained sequestered. In jury selection, Judge Beck had gone to great lengths to screen for bias, especially regarding gender identity, but public pressure was growing. Anonymous threats were sent to the courthouse. Security was increased. Judge Beck made it clear, any breach of decorum would result in contempt charges. Back in court, Harold had begun to show cracks. In one closed-door session with Dr. Canner, he reportedly wept and said, "If I had known in the beginning, I don't know what I would have done. But this? My whole life stopped in a second. I didn't plan it. I snapped. Dr. Canner's notes also included something else. Harold's perception of betrayal seems inseparable from his need to control. He loved her, but only under the terms he believed were real. When those collapsed, he reacted as if she had erased his entire identity. Opening arguments began on a rainy Monday morning. The courthouse was quiet inside, but outside, protesters gathered under umbrellas, two crowds shouting over each other, separated by barricades and a heavy police presence. Inside, the air was cold and tense. Prosecutor Lillian Cho was measured in tone but precise in her wording. She told the jury, "This case is not about gender. It is about choice." Harold Dalton could have walked away. He could have screamed. He could have demanded answers. But he chose violence. And the moment he pulled that trigger, he made himself both judge and executioner. Defense attorney Eric Blanchard countered with a narrative of collapse. "My client did not commit a premeditated murder. He suffered a psychological break after a lifetime of repression and confusion, built upon a lie. We are not asking for sympathy. We are asking for understanding." Both attorneys knew that the case would hinge not just on facts, but on framing. Witness testimony began with Detective Suarez, who walked the jury through the timeline of discovery. Harold's return home, his access to the attic, the locked file box, and the confrontation in the kitchen. A photo of the blood-stained floor was shown. Several jurors looked away. The second witness was Karen Bell, Harold's longtime co-worker. She described Harold as stoic, polite, quiet, but admitted he had strong views on what's normal. Once, she recalled, a transgender teen came into the hardware store and Harold refused to help them. He said, "I don't support delusions." I told him he was out of line and he just shrugged and walked away. The defense objected, but Judge Beck allowed the statement, noting its relevance to establishing Harold's mindset. Then came a surprise. A former neighbor from Bakersfield's early years, Leanne Franklin, came forward voluntarily and testified that Margaret once confided in her after a few glasses of wine. She never said the words outright, Leanne testified, but she said, "I've lived many lives. If he ever finds out about my first one, I don't think he'll let me live a second." The courtroom fell silent. On cross-examination, Blanchard suggested Leanne might be misremembering or embellishing. But the impact of her statement was immediate. Several jurors looked visibly shaken. Judge Beck called for a short recess. During the break, Harold sat still, hands folded, as if bracing for a verdict that hadn't yet come. Dr. Canner, watching from the gallery, made a note. "No visible emotional reaction to Leanne's testimony. Is this control, dissociation, or calculation?" The next phase of the trial focused on character witnesses, beginning with the prosecution's strategic decision to call Dr. Maya Evers, a retired psychologist who once worked with Margaret during her early years in Bakersfield. Her session notes, preserved under subpoena, revealed that Margaret had sought therapy in 1997, shortly after marrying Harold. "Margaret told me she was in love," Dr. Evers testified, "but she also said she was terrified of rejection. She said, 'If I tell him, I'll lose everything. If I don't, I might lose myself.'" The session stopped abruptly in 1999, shortly before Margaret began working in the school district full-time. Defense attorney Eric Blanchard pressed Dr. Evers. Did she ever express an intent to eventually tell her husband the truth? Evers paused before answering. She said she hoped one day the world would be different, but she didn't think Harold would be the kind of man who could forgive. The courtroom was silent again. Next, the defense called Harold's younger sister, Monica Dalton, to the stand. Monica painted a different picture, of a brother raised in a house where feelings were punished, where gender roles were rigid, and where their father's belt often spoke louder than his words. Harold wasn't allowed to cry, Monica said. He wasn't allowed to be confused. Everything had to be black and white, sin or salvation. There was no in-between. Blanchard used Monica's testimony to reinforce the idea of emotional repression and generational trauma. He didn't have the tools to process something like this. No one ever taught him how. But on cross-examination, Prosecutor Cho made a critical move. And yet your brother lived peacefully with Margaret for 27 years. He loved her. He trusted her. He came home to her every day. Are you saying that when faced with a truth he didn't like, the only response he had was to kill her? Monica didn't answer right away. I'm saying he was broken long before this happened. Maybe he never knew how broken. Outside the courtroom, the media coverage intensified. LGBTQ+ advocates demanded the case be recognized as a landmark in how the legal system treats trans lives posthumously. Conservative pundits, meanwhile, called the case a wake-up call about cultural deception. The courthouse became the center of a culture war far larger than the crime itself. Meanwhile, in a sealed evidentiary hearing, the judge reviewed a set of personal letters Margaret had kept, addressed but never sent. One was to Harold. It was dated 2016 and ended with, "I love you, but I live in fear, and that's no way to live. Someday I may find the courage to tell you. I pray you'll still see me as your wife." Judge Beck allowed excerpts of the letter to be read at trial. The courtroom's atmosphere had grown heavier by the day. Judge Beck, recognizing the emotional strain on jurors, ordered a one-day recess. But the break did little to soften the intensity. When court resumed, the prosecution called their final expert witness, Dr. Talia Nguyen, a forensic psychiatrist specializing in gender-based violence. Her analysis was clinical, but her delivery was calm and firm. "What we are witnessing is not simply the aftermath of a discovery," Dr. Nguyen told the court. "This is the result of long-term emotional control, internalized gender expectations, and ultimately, when those expectations collapsed, an act of violent erasure. The victim, Margaret Dalton, was not killed because she deceived her husband. She was killed because in that moment, Harold Dalton could not tolerate the loss of a fantasy he constructed around her. His reaction was not to leave or ask questions, it was to eliminate her. Blanchard immediately objected, accusing Nguyen of overreaching. But the judge overruled, stating that the expert was presenting a psychological theory grounded in Harold's prior behavior and documented biases. The defense retaliated with its own psychiatric witness, Dr. Lewis Hampton, who painted a picture of a man suffering from identity collapse. "When your entire foundation is built on certainty," Dr. Hampton said, "and that foundation is shattered in an instant, it can produce a dissociative state. Harold Dalton wasn't just reacting to Margaret's past. He was experiencing the destruction of his own identity." Cho's cross-examination of Dr. Hampton was unrelenting. "And in this dissociative state, Mr. Dalton was coherent enough to find the gun, load it, aim, and fire, correct?" Hampton hesitated. "Yes, but under severe emotional duress." Cho finished with a chilling reminder. He wasn't disoriented. He wasn't hallucinating. He knew what he was doing. He just didn't want to face what it meant. That afternoon, the jury heard a reading from the unsent letter Margaret had penned in 2016. The words were quiet but devastating. "You once told me that honesty is everything, and yet, I've been silent. Not because I didn't trust you, but because I knew the honesty you asked for came with a condition, that I never be anything other than what you expected. I love you. I've loved you with everything I had, but sometimes love isn't enough when it's built on fear." Several jurors wiped their eyes. Even Judge Beck appeared momentarily rattled. Harold did not react. Outside the courthouse, the trial was now the top national story. News anchors debated it nightly. Activists held vigils for Margaret, placing photos of her smiling in her garden along the courthouse fence. On the opposite sidewalk, counter-protesters held signs reading "Truth Matters Too" and "No More Lies in Marriage." Judge Beck summoned both sides to her chambers in the early hours of day 24 of the trial. Word had reached her clerk that a juror had received an anonymous envelope at the hotel where the panel was sequestered. Inside was a printed flyer showing Margaret's face and the words, "He was fooled. What would you have done?" The envelope had no return address. Court security opened an investigation, and the juror in question, Juror #7, a middle-aged man with a background in law enforcement, was questioned. He insisted he hadn't opened the envelope and turned it in immediately. Beck allowed him to remain, but reminded the jury that any exposure to outside opinion could result in a mistrial. Her tone was stern. "This case is already tearing at the social fabric. It is your job to protect the process, not to bend under pressure from people who will never sit in your seat." Despite rising tension, proceedings resumed. Cho called her final rebuttal witness, Officer Jeremy Luna, one of the first responders on the scene. His testimony was direct and restrained. When we arrived, Harold was seated on the front steps, calm. He said, "It's done. I did what I had to do." "Did he appear disoriented or confused?" Cho asked. "No, ma'am. He seemed clear, resigned. He looked me in the eye when he said, 'She lied for 27 years. That's not a marriage, that's a prison.'" Blanchard tried to suggest Harold was already in psychological shock, but Luna remained firm. He wasn't shaking, he wasn't crying, he was just sure. That word, sure, hung in the air. Later that afternoon, Harold took the stand. The courtroom tensed. Even Cho seemed momentarily surprised. It was a risky move, but Blanchard had few cards left to play. Dressed in a gray suit and speaking softly, Harold addressed the jury. "I didn't want to hurt her," he said. "I loved her. But when I found that box, I didn't know who I was anymore. Everything I built my life on, it felt like it exploded in my hands. I didn't plan it. I wasn't thinking clearly. I just broke." Cho cross-examined swiftly. "Mr. Dalton, you said you loved her, but you shot her, once in the chest and again after she fell. Do you recall that?" Harold lowered his head. "Yes. She wasn't running. She wasn't armed. She wasn't screaming. She stood still. Is that right?" "Yes." "Then let's be clear. You had a choice, and you made one." Silence. The judge recessed for the day shortly afterward. Outside, rain began to fall, a slow, cold drizzle that coated the courthouse steps in gray. News vans remained parked nearby. A woman knelt near the fence, lighting a candle beneath a laminated photo of Margaret smiling with a watering can in her hand. Inside the jury room, the weight of the case was starting to show. One juror requested tissues, another excused herself, returning visibly pale. The court-appointed counselor remained on standby. The next morning, the courthouse opened with unusual silence. The media presence was still strong, but no longer frantic. Everyone knew the case was winding down. The only thing left was for each side to distill nearly a month of testimony into closing arguments. Prosecutor Lillian Cho went first. She began not with evidence, but with Margaret herself. A large photo of her was placed on the screen, taken just 3 weeks before her death, in her garden, watering flowers in the early morning light. She was not a threat. She was not armed. She was not cruel or violent or erratic. She was a woman who built a life from nothing, who carried a secret because the world told her it was dangerous to be known. Cho's voice didn't rise. Instead, it quieted. Margaret Dalton survived rejection, violence, and fear. She survived the system, but she did not survive her husband. Then she turned to the jury. "Mr. Dalton says he broke, but let's be honest. He didn't break when he saw the birth certificate. He didn't break when he picked up the gun. He didn't break when he pointed it, or when he pulled the trigger. He broke only when the truth threatened the lie he told himself about what love was supposed to be." She walked them back through key points: the internet searches, the calm demeanor at the scene, the second shot, and Margaret's journal. She ended with a single line from the unsent letter: "I love you, but I live in fear." Then came the defense. Blanchard's tone was more personal, as if confiding in the jury rather than persuading them. Harold Dalton was raised in a world without room for difference, without space for vulnerability. That doesn't excuse what he did. It explains how he reached that moment. In a single instant, everything he believed about his marriage, his identity, his sense of self collapsed. That's not murder, that's trauma. He reminded the jury of Harold's emotional restraint, of Dr. Hampton's analysis of dissociation, and of his lack of prior violence. He didn't hate Margaret. He loved her. That's what makes this so tragic. This wasn't a hate crime. It was a collapse of a man who was never taught to understand himself, much less anyone else. Blanchard's closing line: "You can punish Harold, or you can recognize that this tragedy began long before the trigger was pulled, and it won't end with another ruined life." The courtroom was still. Even the reporters in the back took fewer notes. After a brief recess, Judge Beck delivered her final instructions to the jury. She emphasized the need to separate emotion from law and reminded them that second-degree murder required evidence of intent, even if that intent was formed moments before the act. They were given 3 charges to consider: second-degree murder, voluntary manslaughter, or not guilty by reason of insanity. By mid-afternoon, the jury was sequestered in deliberation. Outside, the sky darkened. Rain threatened again. On the steps, candles still flickered next to Margaret's photograph, now joined by a single sheet of paper weighed down by a stone. It read, "She only wanted to be loved. That should never be a death sentence." Jury deliberations began in a quiet, temperature-controlled room just off the main courtroom. 12 chairs circled a long table. Juror #3, a nurse in her 50s, was elected foreperson. For hours they sat in near silence, flipping through thick binders of notes, printed exhibits, and highlighted testimony. The photo of Margaret in her garden, submitted as People's Exhibit 47, was placed at the center of the table by an unnamed juror. No one objected, but the first vote showed immediate division. 5 for second-degree murder, 4 for voluntary manslaughter, 3 for not guilty by reason of insanity. It was clear. No consensus. By late evening, the bailiff noted raised voices behind the deliberation room doors. Judge Beck reminded them that they could request clarification on testimony or law. The jury returned 3 questions. Can a person experiencing dissociation still form intent? Does emotional betrayal qualify as provocation under voluntary manslaughter? Are we permitted to consider Harold's internet searches as evidence of premeditation? Judge Beck issued measured responses. Yes, dissociation and intent can coexist. Emotional betrayal may influence perception, but does not excuse murder. And yes, internet searches, if the jury finds them credible, can be used to infer motive. The following day, deliberations continued, this time with more discussion. Juror #6, a retired Marine, leaned toward manslaughter. He snapped. It wasn't right, but I don't think he planned it. Juror #9, a social worker, disagreed. He stood there. He picked up a gun. That's a plan. Juror #1 brought up the letter. Margaret was scared of him. That has to matter. Juror #11, the youngest, added, I can't get past that second shot. That's not panic. That's finishing something. Outside the courtroom, protests swelled again. A march of silent mourners held candles and photos of trans victims of violence. One sign read, Truth killed her, but silence buried her. Meanwhile, Harold sat alone in his holding cell, staring at the wall. He refused meals, according to guards. When his lawyer visited, he reportedly asked only one question. Will they hate me forever? By the third day of deliberations, the jury had narrowed to 2 positions. 8 jurors now leaned towards second-degree murder, 4 held onto voluntary manslaughter. Cho and Blanchard, both visibly exhausted, remained within the courthouse, waiting. Then came a note from the jury room. We request to hear Officer Luna's testimony again. The judge approved playback. The jury sat motionless as Luna's voice played. He said, It's done. I did what I had to do. That sentence landed differently now. Repetition gave it weight, finality. By nightfall, they had not yet reached a verdict. Judge Beck dismissed them until morning. At the nearby hotel where they were housed, Juror #3 sat on the bed, rereading Margaret's letter on a photocopy provided for evidence review. She underlined one sentence with a hotel pen. I knew the honesty you asked for came with a condition, that I never be anything other than what you expected. At 8:42 a.m. on the 4th day of deliberations, the bailiff received a handwritten note from Juror #3. We believe we are approaching a decision, requesting an additional 2 hours. Inside the jury room, the atmosphere had shifted. The last 2 holdouts, jurors #5 and #12, had softened, no longer firmly insisting on manslaughter, but still uncertain about the leap to second-degree murder. Juror #10 proposed a reframing. Let's strip this down. He was calm, he aimed, he pulled the trigger twice. This wasn't rage, this was control. Juror #12, a high school teacher, sighed. But the betrayal, he genuinely believed his marriage was built on a lie. Doesn't that matter? Juror #9 replied, It does, but it doesn't erase what he did. You don't get to kill someone because they didn't tell you something. They reviewed the legal definition of second-degree murder again, the unlawful killing of a human being with malice aforethought, but without premeditation. The term malice aforethought became the final hurdle. Did he want to hurt her? Juror hash 5 asked. Juror hash 1 responded quietly. He wanted to erase her. That settled it. At 11:17 a.m., the jury buzzed for the bailiff. The note they handed him was just 5 words. We have reached a verdict. In the courtroom, a hushed crowd filled the benches. Reporters whispered updates into microphones, and onlookers clutched one another's hands. A few of Margaret's former colleagues sat in the front row, holding printed photos of her beside candles in glass jars. Harold was brought in through a side door. He walked slowly, shoulders hunched, his face pale and unreadable. He glanced once, briefly, at the jury box. Then he sat, expressionless. Judge Beck entered. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, have you reached a unanimous verdict? Juror hash 3 stood. Yes, Your Honor. The clerk unfolded the verdict slip and read aloud. We, the jury, find the defendant, Harold Dalton, guilty of second-degree murder. Gasps filled the room. One woman in the back began to cry softly. Judge Beck thanked the jury for their service and instructed that sentencing would be scheduled within 10 days. Jurors were released from sequestration, but advised to avoid media interviews for at least 48 hours. Harold was led from the courtroom in silence. As he passed Cho's table, he paused for a second. His lips parted as if to say something, but nothing came out. Outside, reporters rushed to transmit the news. Social media exploded within minutes. Hashtags like #JusticeForMargaret, #TransLivesMatter, and #DaltonVerdict began trending nationally. Margaret's neighbor, Leanne Franklin, was approached by press and gave a single statement. She never got to live without fear. At least now, the truth she carried doesn't die with her. Later that evening, a candlelight vigil was held outside the courthouse. Dozens gathered in silence. They didn't speak. They just stood in a circle, holding candles, passing Margaret's photograph hand to hand. Back in his cell, Harold sat on the edge of his bunk. According to the jail log, he didn't speak for the rest of the day. But at one point, a guard observed him holding his head in his hands, whispering to himself. She didn't even scream. 2 days after the verdict, Judge Marianne Beck convened a sentencing hearing in Bakersfield Superior Court. The courtroom was again packed, this time not with speculation, but with expectation. Before the hearing, both sides submitted memoranda. The prosecution recommended a sentence of 15 years to life, citing aggravating factors: Margaret's vulnerability, the nature of the act, and Harold's composure after the killing. The defense requested leniency, arguing Harold had no prior criminal history, had expressed remorse, albeit quietly, and suffered from long-term psychological trauma. Harold was brought into the courtroom in handcuffs, now visibly thinner and paler. His gray suit hung loose on him. For the first time, he seemed to scan the courtroom. His eyes paused briefly on the rows of candles and photos placed behind the prosecution table. His expression didn't change, but his shoulders slumped. Then, for the first time since his arrest, Harold addressed the court. His voice was hoarse. There's no excuse for what I did. I know that now. I told myself I was betrayed, but I was the one who destroyed something good because I couldn't understand it. I didn't give her the chance to speak, and now she never can. He paused, breathing shakily. She was kind. She made me laugh when I forgot how, and I killed her because I was too afraid to see her for who she really was. There were no tears, but his words were clear. Margaret's voice, too, returned, through a video prepared by her friend and former co-worker, Nancy Rice. The court allowed it to be shown in lieu of a victim impact statement. It was a grainy clip from a school retirement event in 2020. Margaret, standing at a podium with modest flowers behind her, smiled. I spent my life trying to make a space for others to feel safe. That's all I ever wanted, to live gently, to give quietly, and to be known, even if only by a few. The courtroom was silent as the screen faded to black. Judge Beck recessed for 1 hour before returning for sentencing. When she did, her tone was deliberate. This case was not about law alone. It was about identity, secrecy, fear, and the cost of silence. But in the end, it is also about choice. And Mr. Dalton, you made one. You ended a life not because you had to, but because you couldn't bear to confront your own reflection. She sentenced Harold Dalton to 16 years to life in state prison, with eligibility for parole after serving 14. Outside, reactions were immediate. Some advocates expressed frustration, calling for hate crime sentencing enhancements that were ultimately denied due to statute limitations. Others saw the verdict as a legal milestone. A petition began circulating to establish Margaret's Law, which would push for federal protections to ensure the safety and privacy of trans individuals in domestic partnerships, especially around posthumous identity respect and protection from forced outing during legal proceedings. Margaret's memory began to spread beyond headlines. Students from her former school organized a garden memorial. A scholarship fund was launched in her name to support LGBTQ+ youth pursuing education careers. Meanwhile, Harold was transferred to Wasco State Prison. Intake officers described him as compliant, quiet, and emotionally flat. During processing, he was asked if he had any next of kin to notify. He reportedly answered, "No one left." 2 months after sentencing, Harold Dalton entered his daily routine at Wasco State Prison. He was placed in protective custody, not for fame but for vulnerability. Older, convicted of a high-profile crime and mentally withdrawn. His cell was clean, almost obsessively so. Guards noted he rarely spoke and never wrote letters. He declined religious services and educational programs. In interviews with a prison psychologist, he showed little emotional response to his surroundings. But once, he asked quietly, "Do you think people remember her with love or anger?" Outside the prison walls, Margaret's name continued to echo, not as a headline, but as a story told in classrooms, panels, and legislative halls. In Sacramento, the early draft of Margaret's Law passed through a state legislative committee. The proposed statute would require enhanced legal protocols in homicide cases involving transgender victims, including mandatory privacy protections during trials and clearer definitions of posthumous identity respect. It also proposed to limit the admissibility of gender history unless directly relevant to the motive or legal defense. Civil rights attorneys called the bill long overdue. Conservative groups pushed back, calling it politicized grief. But Margaret's name remained central in the debate. Her photo, smiling in her garden, was placed on every podium where supporters testified. The scholarship fund in her honor surpassed $75,000 by spring. Its mission, to support LGBTQ+ students pursuing degrees in education. Several of her former students began speaking publicly, describing her quiet encouragement, her gentle guidance, and her unwavering presence. "She never talked about herself much," said one former student in an interview. "But she listened, really listened. Like you mattered. I never felt judged by her, just seen." A national true crime documentary was released 6 months after the trial, sparking new conversations. While some viewers were drawn to the courtroom drama, many found themselves moved most by the segments centered on Margaret's life. The years she lived in silence, in strength, in fear. As for Harold, his first parole hearing would not come for more than a decade. Whether he will express genuine remorse, beyond guilt, remains uncertain. Margaret's story has left the courtroom, but it has not left the culture. Universities have begun citing the case in ethics courses, examining the collision of personal identity and societal rigidity. Legal scholars debate whether the verdict represented progress or simply the minimum bar for justice. But the question that lingers, the one that can't be legislated or appealed, is the one posed by a sign taped to the courthouse gate. If truth kills, how do we make the world safer for honesty? In the end, Margaret's death did not go unnoticed, and her life, once hidden in fear, now lives on in policy, in stories, in memory.